you see. The ancient texts do not describe gods as spirits. No, they describe them as entities made of living gold, with hearts of bronze that hummed with the sound of 1,000 bees. Now, we begin at the edge of the Aegean Sea, where the salt, heavy air clings to the ruins of a world that, well, simply shouldn't have existed. For centuries we have viewed the Olympian pantheon as mere metaphors, grand personifications of the sun, the sea, and the storm. But as we strip away the layers of dust and dogma, a chilling pattern is emerging in those original Greek verses. The descriptions do not speak of ethereal ghosts or shapeless spirits. No, they speak of mechanics. They speak of hydraulics. They speak of a reality where the line between myth and metallurgy completely dissolves. Think of the word immortal for a second. To the modern ear, it sounds like a magical trait, right? But in the oldest fragments of our history, the immortality of the gods sounds less like a divine blessing and more like high-grade durability. These were beings who did not bleed red blood. They leaked ichor, a substance described as a shimmering golden fluid that was often toxic to human touch. They did not possess hearts of flesh, but internal cores that vibrated with a low, mechanical resonance. When we look at the chronicles of Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, we find a creator who did not just forge weapons, but autonomous life. He was said to have built golden handmaidens who possessed the power of speech, the strength of warriors, and the very intelligence of the gods themselves. He constructed Talos, the bronze titan that patrolled the shores of Crete, a massive entity powered by a single vein running from his neck to his ankle, sealed by a massive copper bolt. This leads us to a startling possibility. Was the age of heroes actually an era of forgotten engineering? This is the echo of the living gold, a world where the divine was something you could touch, something that could malfunction, and something that functioned with a cold, calculated precision that we are only now beginning to recognize. You know, we have always assumed the ancients were using flowery language to describe the unknown. But what if they were being literal? What if they were witnesses to a technology so advanced that the only word they had for it was God? Walk into the lecture halls of any modern university, and you will hear the same consensus. The Olympian pantheon was merely a mirror held up to nature. To the academic mind, you see, the ancient Greeks were a primitive people struggling to categorize a chaotic world. They didn't understand the physics of a lightning strike, so they invented a bearded king on a throne to throw it. They didn't understand the shifting of tectonic plates, actually, so they imagined a trident-bearing giant beneath the waves. This is the comfortable boundary of mainstream history, the elemental theory. It suggests that the gods were never real, but instead poetic metaphors designed to make the terrifying randomness of existence feel a little more human. But when we move away from the polished textbooks and return to the original, dust-choked scrolls of the Iliad and the Theogony, well, the poetry begins to look suspiciously like a technical manual. If these gods were merely spirits of the wind and sea, why do the earliest texts obsess over their physical assembly? Why do the poets describe them not as ethereal ghosts emerging from the mist, but as entities with a tangible, heavy presence that caused the very earth to groan under their weight? Consider the descriptions of their physical form. The Greeks had a word for the skin of the gods that differentiated it from the flesh of men, you know. It was often described as having a shimmering, metallic luster, a radiance that could literally blind a mortal who looked upon it without protection. Their movements were not described with the fluid grace of an athlete, but with a rhythmic, grinding power that suggested immense internal force. And then there is the matter of their lifeblood, ichor. In every ancient account, ichor was not like the blood of humans. It was a shimmering, golden fluid, described as being strangely cold and lethally toxic to any mortal who came into contact with it. If the gods were just personified elements, why would they need a specific non-biological substance circulating through their veins? To a modern engineer, ichor doesn't sound like a biological necessity. It sounds like a hydraulic fluid or a high-grade coolant designed to keep a complex system from overheating. This suspicion only deepens when we look at the divine diet of ambrosia and nectar. Skeptically, we are told these were the food and drink of the immortals, but the texts tell a more peculiar story. These substances were not consumed for pleasure or hunger. They were required for incorruptibility. If a god was deprived of them, their brilliance would dim, their joints would seize, and they would lose the ability to speak or move. This isn't a description of a hungry deity. It is a description of a machine undergoing a refueling cycle. It is the ritualistic application of preservatives and energy sources to prevent the degradation of high-grade components. If the gods were truly the infinite, all-powerful spirits of the elements, they should have been timeless and self-sustaining. Yet, the oldest records depict them as vulnerable to wear and tear, dependent on specific substances to remain operational. This leads us to a staggering realization. The ancients weren't writing myths, they were filing maintenance reports. But if the gods were indeed physical machines that required constant upkeep, it raises a question that mainstream history is terrified to answer. If the gods were the hardware, then who was the programmer? Because deep within the volcanic heart of the earth, there was one figure who didn't just walk among the gods, he was the one who manufactured them. Enter the smoke-filled depths of Mount Etna, where the air hums with a vibration that is, well, it's not quite natural. Here, amidst the searing heat of the volcanic forge, we find the figure of Hephaestus. In the traditional myths, you see, he is the god of the forge, the limping blacksmith of the gods. But if we peel back the layers of poetic metaphor, a different image emerges. Hephaestus was not a sorcerer. He was a master engineer, a divine programmer who specialized in the construction of autonomous systems. While the other Olympians were preoccupied with the affairs of mortals, Hephaestus was, you could say, obsessed with the mechanics of existence. His most striking feature was his own immobility. Legends tell us he was lame, requiring assistance to move. But rather than relying on a simple cane, Hephaestus engineered his own solution. He is described as having forged 2 golden handmaidens to support him as he walked. Homer, in the Iliad, provides a description that should chill any modern technologist, right? These were not statues. They were made of solid gold, and yet they possessed a mind and soul, a voice and strength. Most importantly, the text claims they had been taught their skills by the immortal gods. This is a precise ancient description of artificial intelligence, mechanical beings capable of processing information, communicating, and performing complex physical tasks. They were, in essence, the ultimate biomimetic robots, assistants that never tired and never faltered. But Hephaestus's genius didn't end with humanoid forms, actually. Ancient texts describe his tripods, 23-legged tables with golden wheels that he crafted for the assembly of the gods. Mysteriously, these tripods are said to have moved of their own impulse into the divine hall and then returned to their original positions when their service was complete.
Technically minded, we are looking at a description of autonomous, self-navigating units capable of obstacle avoidance and pre-programmed pathing. When we view these accounts through a technical lens, the grand palaces of Mount Olympus begin to look, well, less like marble temples and more like sophisticated docking stations. These homes of the gods were filled with automated furniture and robotic servants, maintaining a high-tech ecosystem that operated with a precision that seemed like magic to the uninitiated. Hephaestus was the one who provided the hardware that allowed the gods to maintain their divinity. He was the source of their chariots, their indestructible weapons, and their gleaming armor. However, the most terrifying evidence of his engineering prowess wasn't found in a golden handmaiden or a moving table. To see the true extent of his mastery, we have to look toward the coast of Crete, where Hephaestus deployed a creation so massive it could sink entire fleets. And it is within the mechanical heart of this giant that we find the literal blood of the gods, a substance that proves these beings were never flesh and bone to begin with. You see, while the tales of Talos and the ichor of the gods may sound like the fever dreams of ancient poets, the Mediterranean floor held a secret that would shatter our understanding of the past forever. In 1901, off the coast of a tiny island called Antikythera, divers recovered a corroded, calcified lump of bronze from the skeleton of a sunken Roman shipwreck. At first, it looked like nothing more than a discarded stone, but as the crust of 2,000 years was peeled away, the world stared into the eye of an impossible reality. Hidden within that bronze shell was a complex system of over 30 interlocking gears, some as delicate as the inner workings of a fine watch, you know? This was the Antikythera mechanism, the world's first analog computer. Modern X-ray scans have since revealed a level of mathematical precision that, according to our traditional timeline, simply shouldn't have existed for another 15 centuries.
It could predict solar eclipses, track the erratic paths of the planets, and even account for the irregular orbit of the moon with terrifying accuracy. I mean, this device was a handheld cosmos, a physical manifestation of what the Greeks called divine knowledge. But here's the question that haunts the halls of archaeology, right? If a standard merchant ship was carrying a device this sophisticated, what was being kept behind the golden doors of the great temples? The Antikythera mechanism proves that the Greeks didn't just imagine complex machinery, they mastered it. If they could compress the movements of the heavens into a box no larger than a book, what was stopping them, or perhaps the gods who supposedly granted them this wisdom, from scaling that technology upward? The gears of this mechanism are a surviving fragment, a tiny rusted window into a much larger, robotic reality. It bridges the gap between the myth of Hephaestus's moving statues and the cold, hard proof of ancient circuitry. Actually, we have been taught these gods were spirits or legends, and yet here we hold the physical evidence of their logic. This device suggests that the automata of Olympus weren't mere metaphors for the power of nature. They were the apex of a lost technological era that we are only just beginning to rediscover. But as we look closer at these mechanical blueprints, we realize that not all of these divine machines were built to track the stars. Some were designed with a much more lethal purpose in mind. Imagine a coastline that never sleeps. On the sun-scorched island of Crete, the golden sands were once patrolled by a sentry that knew no exhaustion, no hunger, and no mercy. This was Talos. You see, the ancient texts, they don't describe him as a man or even a demigod. They describe him as a man of bronze, a gift from Hephaestus himself to King Minos. But when we look past the poetic language of the Hellenistic world, the figure that emerges isn't just a mythological curiosity, right? It is the world's first autonomous defense drone. The accounts are eerily specific about his construction. They don't speak of bones or blood. Instead, they describe a single vein, an internal tube that ran from his neck all the way down to his ankle. This conduit carried ichor, the shimmering, mysterious fluid of the gods. Intense, at the very end of this line, in his heel, sat a bronze nail or a bolt. To the ancient Greeks, this was his only weakness, a divine Achilles' heel. But to a modern engineer, this description is hauntingly familiar. This wasn't a biological organ, it was a pressurized hydraulic line, and the bolt at the ankle, well, it was a drainage valve. When the hero Jason and the sorceress Medea arrived at Crete, Talos did not negotiate. Direct, he performed his primary directive, the total denial of unauthorized entry. Incredible, he patrolled the island 3 times a day, an incredible feat of mobility for a giant made of metal. When ships approached, he didn't just throw rocks, he launched massive boulders with the precision of a modern artillery battery. Some theorists suggest his eyes were more than just polished metal, potentially housing a primitive form of thermal-guided targeting that allowed him to lock on to the heat signatures of wooden hulls against the cool Mediterranean currents.
The death of Talos further strips away the veneer of myth. In Medea didn't defeat him with a sword or a spear, you know. She used incantations to cloud his mind, or perhaps a form of early electronic interference. In the confusion, the bolt in his ankle was dislodged, the ichor flowed out like molten lead, and the bronze giant collapsed. His power source depleted, his mechanical systems seizing as the internal pressure vanished. If Talos was indeed a physical machine, a prototype of ancient robotics, it changes everything we think we know about the age of heroes. It suggests that the gods didn't just rule through fear or faith, but through a terrifying technological superiority that stayed the hands of mortal kings. But Talos, he was only the guardian of the gate. Deep within the mountains of Greece, there are accounts of even more complex entities, beings that didn't just guard the land, but served as the very intellects behind the gods' most secret operations. And the evidence for their existence is hidden in a place no one thought to look. The poets of old once spoke of a substance that defied the very laws of biology. They called it ichor. Imagine, if you will, the heat of battle on the dusty plains of Troy, when a spear point finally managed to pierce the shimmering skin of a god. What spilled forth was not the deep crimson of human life. No, it was a translucent, golden fluid, ethereal, shimmering, and utterly alien. Homer tells us that the gods do not eat the bread of men, nor do they drink their wine, and therefore they are bloodless. But if they were bloodless, they were certainly not empty. Now, if we look at these descriptions through the lens of modern engineering, the mystery of ichor takes on a terrifyingly practical form. In the world of high-performance machinery, we don't use blood to sustain motion, do we? We use hydraulic fluids, we use coolants, and when we look at the most extreme environments, the vacuum of space or the heart of a nuclear reactor, we look to the most stable elements on the periodic table. Gold, you see, is one of the most efficient conductors of electricity and heat in existence. Today, gold-based lubricants are used in cutting-edge aerospace technology because they do not evaporate, they do not corrode, and they maintain their integrity under the most punishing temperatures. If the gods were physical machines, after all, their blood would need to be a substance that could power complex servos and cool massive internal processors without ever failing. Ichor wasn't a divine gift. It was a high-conductivity, gold-based hydraulic fluid designed to keep a mechanical titan operational for millennia. This explains why ichor was described as being lethally toxic to mortals. To a biological human, a leak of this substance wasn't a spiritual event. It was a chemical disaster. It was a caustic, perhaps even radioactive synthetic compound pouring from a ruptured line. But even the most advanced machine cannot run on its internal fluids alone. It requires a constant intake of energy. This brings us to the true nature of nectar and ambrosia. For centuries, we have imagined the gods feasting on honeyed delights, but the ancient texts describe these substances as the very thing that maintained their immortality. Gravelly, without them, the gods would wither, their power would fade.
In a mechanical context, nectar and ambrosia lose their poetic charm and reveal their true function: highly refined fuel and synthetic lubricants. Ambrosia, often described as an ointment, acted as a sealant for the gods' metallic flesh, while nectar served as the high-octane energy source required to keep their reactors humming. They weren't eating for pleasure, they were refueling for survival. But this dependency reveals a staggering vulnerability. Even a god is a slave to its power source. Eerily, history whispers of a time when that source began to run dry. If these were machines, what happened when the fuel lines were cut? What happens to a god when its internal clock finally begins to wind down? The answer, you see, lies not in the heavens, but in the decaying ruins of a place the ancients feared to name. The gears did not grind to a halt overnight, no. It was a slow, agonizing descent into silence. As the power cells flickered and the exotic fuels that sustained the Olympians vanished, the wonders of the ancient world began to fossilize. The bronze skin of Talos did not rot, it oxidized. The golden maidens of Hephaestus didn't die, they simply stopped moving, their internal clocks winding down until they became nothing more than statues for future kings to gaze upon in bewilderment. You see, we have always viewed the dawn of Greece as the childhood of humanity, a time of primitive wonder and poetic imagination. But look closer at the wreckage. Perhaps, just perhaps, we are not looking at a beginning, but at the long, flickering shadows of a peak we have yet to reach again. The gods did not abandon us, they simply ran out of energy, leaving behind a world that forgot how to maintain them. Their temples were hangars, their nectar was a chemical necessity, and their myths? They were technical manuals, translated into the only language a pre-industrial mind could understand. The blueprints were never truly lost. They were hidden in the dust of the Parthenon and the echoes of the Iliad, waiting for a generation that could finally decode the metal beneath the myth. Today, as we stand on the precipice of a new era, building silicon mines and titanium limbs, we feel a strange, haunting sense of familiarity. We call it innovation, but it feels more like a recovery. Our current drive toward artificial intelligence and robotics is not a new invention of the modern mind. It is an ancestral memory. You see, we are not merely dreaming of the future. We are remembering the past. We are rebuilding the physical machines we once worshipped, driven by a subconscious need to hear the hum of those gears once more. The silence in the ruins is not empty. It is a waiting. It is a quiet expectation that one day we will finally possess the power to turn the key and wake what has been sleeping in the dust. If you have felt the weight of these ancient secrets, and if you can see the glint of metal beneath the weathered marble, then you are now part of this investigation. The ruins have much more to tell us if we only dare to listen to the echoes of the hidden epoch. What do you believe? I mean, are we creating something new, or are we simply reclaiming a lost throne? Share your theories in the comments below and subscribe as we continue to sift through the debris of the gods to find the truth of our origins.